Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. 2 years ago, I was 21 and completely lost. College had chewed me up and spit me out after 3 semesters of engineering classes that made my brain feel like mush. So there I was, living in my beat-up Civic, scrolling through job listings on my phone outside a McDonald's in Fargo, using their Wi-Fi. That's when I saw the posting for Harrison Farms, seasonal work, housing included, no experience necessary. The pay wasn't great, but free housing meant I could finally stop sleeping in my car. I called the number, and within 2 days I was driving down a dirt road toward what would become the most terrifying experience of my life. The farm stretched endlessly in every direction. Nothing but flat fields of sugar beets under the massive North Dakota sky. My new boss, Carl Harrison, met me at the main building. A weathered man in his 60s with sun-damaged skin and pale blue eyes that never seemed to blink. He showed me to the worker quarters, a converted shipping container with bunk beds and a tiny bathroom. 3 other guys lived there: Eduardo from Guatemala, Dimitri from Ukraine, and Tommy, a local kid about my age. They all kept to themselves, barely acknowledging me when I moved in. The atmosphere felt heavy, like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something bad to happen. My job was simple enough: operate the tractor, plow the designated fields, harvest when ready. Carl handed me a laminated map on my first day, with different sections marked in various colors. He pointed to a patch outlined in red near the eastern edge of the property. See this section here? That's off limits. Old irrigation system underground. Real expensive to fix if you damage it. You plow anywhere but there, understand? His finger lingered on the red zone longer than necessary, and something in his voice made it clear this wasn't just about irrigation. I nodded, folded the map, and figured it would be easy enough to avoid one small section in hundreds of acres. The days blurred together. Wake at dawn, coffee from a pot that tasted like motor oil, then hours on the tractor under the endless sky. The other workers continued to avoid conversation beyond basic pleasantries. Eduardo would sometimes mutter prayers in Spanish while working. Dimitri chain-smoked during breaks, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. Tommy just worked in silence, earbuds always in, completely checked out. After 2 weeks, I started to understand their behavior. This place had a weight to it, a thickness in the air that made you want to finish your work and disappear into your bunk. But the money was steady. I had a roof over my head, and I figured I could handle a few months of weird vibes. Everything changed on a Thursday morning in late September. The sunrise painted the fields orange and pink, and a light fog hung over the beets like a blanket. I was working the eastern section, carefully following my usual route, when the tractor's GPS started glitching. The screen flickered, showing me about 50 yards off from where I actually was. I tried recalibrating it, but the thing kept jumping around, placing me in different spots every few seconds. Without the GPS, I had to rely on visual landmarks, but in those endless fields, one row of beets looks exactly like another. I pulled out the laminated map, trying to orient myself, squinting at the faded markers and comparing them to what I could see through the morning haze. That's when I made the mistake. I thought I was safely west of the restricted zone, but the fog and the identical rows had turned me around. The plow hit something solid with a metallic screech that made my teeth hurt. I killed the engine immediately, my heart hammering as I climbed down to check the damage. The plow had caught the edge of something buried about 3 feet down, something that definitely wasn't an irrigation pipe. Through the churned earth, I could see rusted metal, maybe the corner of what looked like a vehicle. My first thought was that I'd found some old farm equipment, buried and forgotten, but as I knelt down and brushed away more dirt with my gloved hands, I realized I was looking at the tailgate of a pickup truck. The Ford logo was still visible under layers of rust and dirt. The truck had been light blue once, maybe baby blue, though now it was mostly the color of the earth that had swallowed it. I should have stopped digging, should have gotten back on the tractor and reported it to Carl. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and I kept clearing away dirt, revealing more of the truck bed. That's when I saw the license plate, North Dakota tags, still partially readable despite the years underground. My phone had signal out there, surprisingly, and I took a photo before Googling North Dakota license plate lookup. The results made my mouth go dry. The plate belonged to a 1997 Ford F-150 registered to Miguel Vega, reported missing 6 years ago, along with its owner. The news article was still online. Migrant worker vanishes from Harrison Farms. Miguel had been 28, had a wife and 2 kids back in Chihuahua. He'd been working the sugar beet harvest, just like me, when he supposedly left in the middle of the night without collecting his final paycheck. The article quoted Carl Harrison saying Miguel had seemed homesick, probably decided to head back to Mexico, but here was his truck, buried in the forbidden section of the field. I walked around to the driver's side, my boots sinking into the soft, disturbed earth. The window was down about halfway, and even though years of dirt had filtered in, I could see inside. That's when the smell hit me. Not strong, but distinct, like old leather mixed with something sweet and wrong. I used my phone's flashlight to peer through the gap. The beam cut through the darkness inside the cab, illuminating the steering wheel, the dashboard covered in a thick layer of dust, and then the shape in the driver's seat. It took my brain a moment to process what I was seeing. Clothes had mostly rotted away, but denim lasts forever, and I could see the remains of jeans. The seatbelt was still fastened. Where the head should have been, there was only a skull tilted back against the headrest, mouth open like he'd been screaming. One skeletal hand still gripped the steering wheel. The other lay on what was left of his lap, fingers curled around something metallic. I leaned closer, fighting the urge to vomit, and saw it was a small silver cross on a chain, the kind you'd wear around your neck. I stumbled backward, tripping over a clump of dirt and landing hard on my ass. My whole body felt electric with panic. This wasn't just a missing person. This was murder. Someone had buried Miguel in his own truck, right here on Harrison property. I scrambled to my feet and ran back to the tractor, my mind racing. Should I call the police right now? Go tell Carl? As I climbed into the cab, I saw movement in the distance. Carl's white pickup heading my way, kicking up a cloud of dust. He must have seen me stopped out here. My gut twisted as I watched him approach, and suddenly Eduardo's prayers and Dimitri's nervous smoking made perfect sense. They knew. Maybe not the details, but they knew this farm held dark secrets. Carl pulled up beside the tractor and got out slowly, his movements deliberate and calm. He walked over to where I'd been digging, stood there for a long moment looking down at the exposed truck, then turned to face me. His expression was completely blank, those pale blue eyes as cold as the North Dakota winter. "Come on down here, son," he said, his voice steady and quiet. I climbed down on shaking legs, trying to keep my face neutral, like I hadn't just found a corpse. Carl lit a cigarette, took a long drag, and exhaled slowly. "You know what you found?" he asked. I nodded, not trusting my voice. He studied me for what felt like hours, then said, "Miguel was stealing from me. Skimming wages from the other workers, taking equipment. When I confronted him, he pulled a knife." He paused, flicking ash onto the disturbed earth. It was self-defense. The lie was so smooth, so practiced, that I knew he'd told it before. Maybe to himself, maybe to others who'd asked too many questions. I also knew that arguing would be pointless and dangerous. Carl stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the tobacco on his breath. "Now, you got 2 choices. You can forget what you saw here, finish out the season, take a nice bonus when you leave and never come back. Or..." He didn't finish the sentence, but his hand moved to his hip, pushing back his jacket just enough to reveal the pistol tucked into his waistband. "The thing about workers who disappear," he continued, "is that nobody really looks for them, especially dropouts with no family checking in." My throat felt like sandpaper. I managed to croak out, "I'll finish the season." Carl smiled then, the kind of expression that never reaches the eyes. Smart boy. Now you're gonna help me cover this back up. Then you're gonna go back to work like nothing happened. And if I hear you've been talking to the other workers, to anyone in town, to anyone at all, well, there's plenty of room in these fields. We spent the next hour shoveling dirt back over Miguel's truck, covering up the evidence of a life stolen. When we finished, Carl handed me a rag to wipe my face and said, "GPS should be working fine now. Funny how these things fix themselves." He drove off, leaving me standing there in the field, knowing I was trapped. That night, I lay in my bunk, staring at the ceiling, the photo of Miguel's license plate burning a hole in my phone. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, just kept thinking about his family, still wondering what happened to him. The next 3 weeks were torture. I went through the motions, wake up, work, eat, sleep, but inside I was coming apart. Carl watched me constantly, sometimes just sitting in his truck at the edge of whatever field I was working. The other workers noticed the change too. Eduardo started leaving small offerings of food outside my bunk, like he was feeding a condemned man. Tommy actually spoke to me one night, just 4 words whispered in the dark. He's done it before. That's when I knew I had to get out, bonus or no bonus. I started planning, careful not to change my routine. I'd been smart enough to email the photo to myself and delete it from my phone, knowing Carl might check. On a Sunday morning in mid-October, I told Carl I needed to go to town for supplies, toothpaste, deodorant, the usual stuff. He studied me for a long moment before tossing me the keys to one of the farm trucks. "Be back by noon," he said, "or I'll come looking." I drove straight to the police station in Minot, my hands gripping the wheel so tight they went numb. The detective who took my statement, a woman named Patricia Brennan, had kind eyes and listened without interrupting. When I showed her the photo and told her everything, she made a call to the FBI. Apparently, crimes on farms using migrant workers fell under federal jurisdiction. Within hours, the place was swarming with agents. They found Miguel's truck exactly where I'd said it would be, along with 2 other vehicles buried in different sections of the farm. 3 families finally got answers. Carl was arrested at a truck stop near the Canadian border, trying to run with a bag full of cash. The other workers were relocated and given temporary protective status as witnesses. I testified via video link from an undisclosed location. The FBI took the death threats Carl's nephews had been making pretty seriously. Last I heard, Carl got life without parole. I still have nightmares about that morning in the field, about Miguel's skull tilted back in eternal silence. But at least his family could finally bury him properly. And that cross he'd been holding is back with his widow. Sometimes doing the right thing means risking everything. Sometimes it's the only choice that lets you sleep at night. The grant money wasn't much, but for a grad student studying soil composition and crop rotation patterns in rural Georgia, it was enough. I found the farmhouse listing on a university board, 40 acres of fallow land with a 2-bedroom house that hadn't been updated since the 70s. The rent was suspiciously cheap, even for middle-of-nowhere Georgia, but I figured the owner just wanted someone to keep an eye on the property. The landlord, Mrs. Whitfield, mentioned over the phone that her previous tenant, a man named Garrett, had lived there for nearly 2 decades before moving to a trailer park 20 minutes away. She said he might drop by occasionally to collect some tools he'd left in the barn, and that I shouldn't mind him. Agricultural research can be pretty solitary work, so I didn't think much about having an occasional visitor. The property was exactly what I needed for my research. Untouched farmland with varying soil conditions and old irrigation infrastructure I could study and map. I spent my first 2 months taking soil samples, cataloging the existing plant life, and planning where I'd set up my test plots. The house itself was livable enough, though it smelled like decades of cigarette smoke and had that peculiar mustiness that comes from a place being closed up too long. I threw myself into the work, grateful for the isolation after years of cramped dorm living in shared apartments. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles down the road, and cell service was spotty at best. It was just me, my research, and the occasional coyote howling in the distance at night. It was early March when I started working on the old irrigation system. The property had a network of pipes and channels that hadn't been used in years, all clogged with roots and sediment. I needed to understand the water table and drainage patterns for my research, so I began the tedious process of mapping and clearing the lines. About 200 yards from the house, near what used to be a peach orchard, I found a section where the pipes seemed to converge. The area was overgrown with kudzu and brambles, and as I hacked through the vegetation, my shovel hit something solid, not stone or pipe, but wood. After clearing away years of plant growth and accumulated dirt, I uncovered what looked like old sheets of plywood, weathered and partially rotted, covering something beneath. The wood came away in pieces, revealing a circular stone rim underneath. It was an old well, probably hand-dug judging by the irregular stonework. The opening was about 4 feet across, lined with field stones that disappeared into darkness below. I grabbed my flashlight from the truck and aimed it down the shaft. The beam barely reached the bottom, maybe 20 feet down, where I could make out what looked like dried leaves and debris. But there was something else down there too. Something wrapped in what appeared to be chicken wire, partially buried in the accumulated detritus at the bottom. The shape was wrong somehow, too deliberate to be random farm waste. As my eyes adjusted and the flashlight beam steadied, I realized I was looking at bones. Human bones unmistakably arranged in the fetal position, bound tightly in rusted wire. The rational part of my brain kicked in immediately. This could be old, really old. Georgia has a long history, and rural properties like this often have forgotten graves or family plots, but the chicken wire bothered me. That kind of galvanized wire mesh wasn't something you'd find in a historical burial. I climbed back into my truck and drove to the house, my mind racing through what I should do. Call the police, obviously, but I needed better pictures first, some kind of documentation. I grabbed my good camera, a measuring tape, and a longer rope from the barn. When I got back to the well, I secured the rope to a nearby tree and lowered myself down just far enough to get clearer shots. The smell hit me about halfway down. Not the ancient mustiness you'd expect from old bones, but something else, something that made my throat close up. It was the smell of decay that hadn't quite finished its work. Through the camera lens, the details became horrifyingly clear. The skeleton was small, maybe a teenager or a small adult, and the wire wasn't just wrapped around it, it was methodically wound, layer after layer, like someone had taken their time. There were scraps of fabric caught in the wire, faded but not disintegrated, and what looked like the remnants of duct tape around where the skull's mouth would be. I took photo after photo, my finger working automatically while my mind tried to process what I was seeing. This wasn't some Civil War-era burial or a forgotten cemetery plot. This was recent. The bones were too clean, too white. Whatever had happened here, it couldn't have been more than a few years ago. I hauled myself out of that well faster than I'd gone down, scraping my palms raw on the stone edges in my hurry. The sheriff's department took 3 hours to arrive after my call. 2 deputies showed up first, young guys who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. They peered down the well with their flashlights, made some calls, and told me to wait by the house. By evening, the property was swarming with people, state police, forensic teams, even a few FBI agents who wouldn't tell me why they were there. They put up a tent over the well and brought in special equipment to extract the remains. I gave my statement 6 different times to 6 different people, each one asking the same questions with slight variations. When did I find it? Had I touched anything? Who else knew about the well? Had I seen anyone on the property recently? The forensic team worked through the night, their generator-powered lights turning the old peach orchard into a harsh, shadowless crime scene. The lead detective, a woman named Hensley who looked like she'd seen too many crime scenes, finally told me what they'd found. The remains belonged to a young woman, probably late teens or early 20s, who'd been reported missing from Valdosta 5 years ago. She'd been alive when she went into the well. They could tell from the position of the bones and other details I didn't want to know. The chicken wire had been wrapped around her while she was still breathing. The duct tape remnants confirmed what the positioning suggested. Detective Hensley asked me again about the property's history, about anyone who might have had access to this area. That's when I remembered what Mrs. Whitfield had said about Garrett, the former tenant who still came by to check on things. According to her, he'd been the only person with regular access to the property for the past 20 years. They asked me to describe Garrett, but I'd never actually met him. Mrs. Whitfield had made it sound like he was just some harmless old guy who couldn't quite let go of the place. The detectives exchanged looks when I mentioned this, and Hensley asked if I had Mrs. Whitfield's contact information. Within an hour, they'd pulled up Garrett's records. Garrett Colby, 63 years old, living in a rundown trailer park called Pine Grove. No criminal record, just a couple of old DUIs from the 90s. He'd worked various farm labor jobs over the years, nothing steady. Nothing that would mark him as anything other than a rural Georgia drifter. But the timeline was damning. He'd been the sole tenant of this property from 2001 to 2023, and the girl in the well had disappeared in 2019. The math was simple and terrible. 2 days later, while the forensic team was still processing the scene, Garrett showed up. I was sitting on the porch trying to focus on my laptop, but mostly just staring at the activity near the well, when an old Ford Ranger pulled up the drive. The man who got out was smaller than I'd imagined, maybe 5'6", wearing overalls and a John Deere cap that had seen better days. He had the leathery skin of someone who'd spent decades in the Georgia sun and pale blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He walked right up to the porch like he owned the place, which I guess in a way he felt he did after 20 years. "You the college boy renting from Mrs. Whitfield?" he asked, his voice carrying that slow, rural drawl that could mean anything from friendly to menacing. I nodded, unsure what to say. His eyes drifted toward the commotion by the old orchard, and something in his expression shifted, just for a second. Not surprise exactly, but maybe resignation. "Found my well, did you?" he said, and the way he said "my" made every hair on my neck stand up. Before I could respond, Detective Hensley was walking toward us, her hand resting on her service weapon. Garrett saw her coming and did something I'll never forget. He smiled. Not a nervous smile or a confused smile, but the satisfied smile of someone who'd been waiting for this moment. "Took you long enough," he said to her, holding out his wrists like he expected to be cuffed right there. I was wondering when someone would finally look under that wood. Been driving me crazy, knowing she was down there calling out to everyone who walked by. The detective had her cuffs out, but she paused at his words. "Calling out?" she asked. Garrett nodded, his eyes distant now. "Oh yes, ma'am, every night for 5 years. Scratching at the stones, whispering up through the earth. Why do you think I moved to that trailer? Couldn't stand the noise anymore." They took him away in the back of a patrol car, and I watched from the porch as he stared out the window at me. No emotion on his face, just that same distant look, like he was listening to something only he could hear. The investigation revealed 2 more bodies in wells on neighboring abandoned properties, both young women who'd gone missing in the early 2000s. Garrett confessed to all 3 murders without any prompting, describing in detail how he'd chosen women who were passing through, ones who wouldn't be missed immediately. He'd kept them alive in the wells for days, dropping down water and food, listening to them plead and scream until their voices gave out. The prosecutor said it was one of the worst cases they'd seen in Georgia. I couldn't finish my research grant. Every time I tried to work on the property, I'd find myself staring at that section of the orchard, remembering the smell from the well and Garrett's casual admission. I broke my lease after 3 weeks and drove back to Atlanta in a single day, leaving most of my equipment behind. The university understood. How could they not? Sometimes at night, when I'm lying in my apartment surrounded by city noise and streetlights, I think about what Garrett said, about her calling out for 5 years. I know it's impossible. I know the dead don't speak. But I also know I'll never go near another well for as long as I live. I moved to Pennsylvania in early 2021 after losing my job as a nurse during the pandemic. Money was tight, and when I saw a posting for a temporary caretaking position on a rural farm outside Lancaster, I jumped at the chance. The pay was decent, and it included housing in a small guest cottage on the property. I'd be looking after an 82-year-old man named Walter Hoffman, who owned a sprawling 200-acre farm that had been in his family for 3 generations. Walter was recovering from a hip replacement surgery and needed help with daily tasks, medication management, and light housekeeping. The job seemed straightforward enough. Cook his meals, help him get around, make sure he took his pills on time. What I didn't expect was how isolated the place would feel, especially during those long winter evenings when the wind would howl through the bare trees surrounding the property. Walter was a peculiar old man with thick, wire-rimmed glasses that magnified his pale blue eyes to an unsettling degree. He had this habit of staring at you for just a beat too long before responding to questions, like he was processing something deeper than what you'd actually said. His voice was soft and raspy, almost whisper-like, which made conversations feel oddly intimate even when we were discussing mundane things like grocery lists or his physical therapy exercises. The farmhouse itself was a maze of creaking floorboards and dimly lit hallways, lined with faded family photographs dating back to the early 1900s. Walter rarely left his recliner in the living room except for meals and bathroom breaks, spending most of his days watching old westerns on a small television with the volume turned up uncomfortably loud. He'd often mutter comments to himself during the shows, sometimes chuckling at jokes that weren't funny, or making observations about the characters that seemed oddly personal. The property had several outbuildings scattered across the acreage, a large red barn that hadn't housed livestock in decades, a smaller equipment shed, and what Walter called his workshop, though he never elaborated on what kind of work he'd done there. During my first few weeks, I'd occasionally see him staring out the kitchen window toward the barn area, with an expression I couldn't quite read. When I'd ask what he was looking at, he'd just shake his head and change the subject. The barn itself was easily 100 years old, with weathered wood siding and a metal roof that had patches of rust bleeding down like old stains. I'd walk past it during my evening strolls around the property, trying to peer through the gaps in the boards, but the interior was too dark to make out much beyond some old farm equipment and stacks of what looked like building materials covered in tarps. It was during the second week of February when I first noticed the concrete slabs. I'd been taking Walter's old collie Buster for his afternoon walk when the dog suddenly bolted toward the backside of the barn, barking at something I couldn't see. The recent snowmelt had turned the ground muddy and uneven, and as I followed Buster around the corner, I could make out these rectangular shapes partially exposed in the soft earth. At first glance, they looked like old foundation stones or maybe remnants of a demolished building, but something about their uniform size and spacing struck me as odd. There were at least 6 of them that I could count, each roughly the size of a large dining room table, arranged in 2 neat rows. The concrete was old and weathered, with moss and lichen growing in the cracks, but you could still see the smooth finish that suggested they'd been professionally poured. Buster kept pawing at one of the slabs and whining in a way I'd never heard before, like he was trying to tell me something important. When I brought Walter his evening medication that night, I casually mentioned the concrete slabs behind the barn. The change in his demeanor was immediate and unmistakable. His face went completely pale, and he set down his water glass with a trembling hand. For a long moment, he just stared at me through those thick glasses, and I could see a muscle twitching in his jaw. Then he cleared his throat and told me in that whisper-soft voice that those were just old septic system remnants from when the property had multiple buildings. He said his father had torn down several structures in the 1960s, and that what I'd found was just leftover foundation work. But there was something in his tone, a forced casualness that didn't match the obvious distress on his face. He kept fidgeting with the hem of his cardigan and avoided making eye contact for the rest of the evening. When I offered to help him to bed later, he declined, something he'd never done before, and I could hear him moving around his room well past midnight. The next morning, Walter was waiting for me in the kitchen when I came over from the cottage to prepare his breakfast. He'd dressed himself, which was unusual since he typically needed help with buttons and shoelaces, and he was sitting rigidly at the kitchen table with his hands folded in front of him. He told me he'd been thinking about our conversation the night before, and that he wanted to show me something. His voice had that same strained quality, but there was also something else. Almost like he was relieved to finally talk about whatever was weighing on him. He led me slowly through the house to a small room I'd never been in before, which he used as a makeshift office. The walls were covered with yellowed newspaper clippings, old photographs, and what looked like business documents dating back several decades. On his desk was a thick manila folder tied with string, and when he opened it, I could see certificates, licenses, and official-looking papers with letterheads I didn't recognize. Walter sat down heavily in his desk chair and began explaining that before he'd become a full-time farmer, he'd operated what he called a family mortuary service out of the barn. He said it wasn't exactly legal. He'd never gotten proper licensing or permits. But in the 1970s and early 1980s, he'd provided burial services for families who couldn't afford traditional funeral homes. According to him, he'd learned embalming techniques from his uncle, who'd worked in the funeral industry, and he'd help local families prepare their deceased loved ones for burial. He showed me some of the paperwork, including handwritten receipts and thank you notes from families expressing gratitude for his services. But as he talked, his story started to feel rehearsed, like he'd practiced this explanation many times before. There were gaps in his timeline, and when I asked specific questions about the licensing or health department oversight, he'd become vague and change the subject. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about those concrete slabs and Walter's explanation. Something about the whole situation felt wrong, but I couldn't pinpoint exactly what. I started paying closer attention to Walter's behavior, and I noticed he'd begun watching me more carefully, especially when I was outside near the barn area. He'd position himself by the kitchen window whenever I took Buster for walks, and I'd catch him tracking my movements with those magnified eyes. He also started asking me detailed questions about my background, where I'd worked before, whether I had family in the area, if I'd told anyone about the job or the property. When I mentioned that I'd video chatted with my sister in California and shown her the farmhouse, he became visibly agitated and asked me not to share any more details about the property with outsiders. He said he valued his privacy and didn't want people getting curious about the old farm buildings. The breaking point came on a rainy Wednesday morning in late February. I was helping Walter with his physical therapy exercises when his phone rang, an old landline that rarely received calls. The conversation was brief, but I could hear a man's voice on the other end speaking in urgent, clipped tones. Walter's responses were mostly yes and no, but I caught him saying something about keeping quiet and too much time has passed. After he hung up, he sat in his recliner for nearly an hour without speaking, just staring at the television screen even though it wasn't turned on. When I asked if everything was all right, he snapped at me for the first time since I'd started working there, telling me to mind my own business and focus on my job duties. That afternoon, I noticed a dark blue sedan parked at the end of the long driveway, far enough away that I couldn't see the license plate, but close enough to make me nervous. The car sat there for about 3 hours before disappearing, and when I mentioned it to Walter, he claimed he hadn't seen anything. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I couldn't shake the feeling that those concrete slabs weren't just old septic remnants, and Walter's increasingly paranoid behavior was making me genuinely afraid for my safety. I used my laptop to research the property records online, and what I found made my stomach turn. The farm had been the subject of multiple police inquiries over the years, missing persons cases where people had last been seen in the area, suspicious activity reports from neighbors, and at least 2 formal investigations that had been closed without resolution. There was also a news article from 1983 about a state health department investigation into unlicensed mortuary operations in rural Pennsylvania, and while Walter's name wasn't mentioned specifically, the description of the location matched his property perfectly. I spent hours reading through everything I could find, and by dawn, I'd made up my mind to contact the authorities. I called the Pennsylvania State Police from my cottage that morning while Walter was still sleeping. The trooper I spoke with, Sergeant Williams, listened patiently as I explained the situation and described what I'd found behind the barn. He said they'd had the property on their radar for years due to various tips and reports, but they'd never had enough evidence to justify a search warrant. However, my first-hand account of the concrete slabs, combined with the property's history, was enough to move forward with an investigation. He told me to act normal around Walter and promised that officers would be out to the property within 24 hours. The rest of that day was torture. I had to prepare Walter's meals, help him with his exercises, and make small talk while knowing that everything was about to unravel. He seemed to sense that something had changed, though, because he kept asking me if I was feeling well and making comments about how I seemed distant and distracted. The police arrived the next morning with a search warrant and a team of forensic specialists. Walter answered the door in his bathrobe, and the look of resigned defeat on his face told me everything I needed to know. He didn't protest or ask questions. He just nodded slowly and stepped aside to let them in. I watched from the cottage window as they cordoned off the area behind the barn and began the careful process of excavating around the concrete slabs. What they found over the next 3 days would make headlines across the state. Each slab covered a shallow grave containing human remains, some dating back to the 1970s, as Walter had claimed, but others were much more recent. The forensics team eventually recovered the remains of 11 people, ranging in age from teenagers to elderly adults. Some showed signs of trauma that suggested violent deaths, while others appeared to have died from natural causes. The investigation revealed that Walter had indeed operated an unlicensed mortuary service, but he'd also been disposing of bodies for local criminals who needed to make people disappear permanently. Walter was arrested and charged with multiple counts of improper disposal of human remains, operating an unlicensed mortuary, and conspiracy to commit murder. During his interrogation, he confessed to helping dispose of bodies for a criminal organization that had operated throughout Pennsylvania and parts of New Jersey during the 1970s and 1980s. He claimed he'd only provided burial services and had never been directly involved in any killings, but the evidence suggested otherwise. Some of the victims had been reported missing over the decades, while others had never been reported at all, likely people who'd fallen through society's cracks and wouldn't be missed. The phone call I'd overheard that Wednesday morning had apparently been from someone warning Walter that old associates were being questioned by federal investigators working on cold cases. That's why he'd become so paranoid and controlling in those final days. He knew it was only a matter of time before everything came to light. I testified at Walter's trial 8 months later, describing what I'd observed during my time caring for him, and how I'd discovered the concrete slabs. The courtroom was packed with family members of the victims, some of whom had been searching for answers for over 40 years. Walter, now confined to a wheelchair and looking far older than his 82 years, showed little emotion throughout the proceedings. He was ultimately sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, though his advanced age and declining health meant he'd likely die behind bars within a few years. The farm was seized by the state and eventually sold at auction, with the proceeds going to a victim compensation fund. I often wonder what happened to Buster, the old collie who'd first led me to those concrete slabs. The investigating officers told me he'd been taken to a local animal shelter, but I never followed up to see if he'd found a new home. Looking for work as a single mom isn't easy, especially when you're behind on rent and your 6-year-old daughter keeps asking why you cry in the bathroom. I had been job hunting for 3 months when I saw the listing on Craigslist. Live-in farm manager position in rural Oklahoma, housing provided, decent pay. The ad was posted by someone named Benjamin Hayes, and when we talked on the phone, his voice had this warm, grandfatherly quality that immediately put me at ease. He told me about his 400-acre property, how he needed someone reliable to help with the day-to-day operations since his arthritis was getting worse. "It's peaceful out here," he said. "Perfect place for a little one to grow up." I packed our bags that same week. The drive to Hayes Farm took us through endless wheat fields and past tiny towns with populations smaller than my old apartment building. Emma, my daughter, had her face pressed against the window the entire time, pointing at every cow and horse we passed. When we finally turned down the long gravel driveway, I felt something loosen in my chest for the first time in months. The farmhouse was exactly like something from a postcard. White wood siding, wraparound porch, red barn in the distance. Benjamin Hayes emerged from the front door as we pulled up, a tall man in his 70s with silver hair and kind blue eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He wore a pressed flannel shirt and clean work boots, and when he smiled, deep wrinkles formed around his eyes. "Welcome home," he said, and I almost believed it. The first few weeks were like living in a dream I didn't want to wake up from. Emma had acres to explore safely, and Benjamin treated her like the granddaughter he never had, teaching her to collect eggs from the chickens and letting her name all the barn cats. My responsibilities were manageable, feeding the livestock, maintaining the fences, keeping track of supplies and schedules. Benjamin had mentioned he was a retired pastor, and it showed in everything he did. He said grace before every meal, kept his property immaculate, and spoke about his late wife Margaret with the kind of reverence usually reserved for saints. The guest cottage where Emma and I lived was cozy and clean, with fresh flowers in mason jars and quilts that smelled like lavender. For the first time since her father left, I felt like we might actually be okay. But around the 4th week, I started noticing the smell. It was subtle at first, just a whiff of something unpleasant when the wind blew from the east side of the property. The old water tank sat about 50 yards behind the main house, a rusted metal cylinder that Benjamin said hadn't been used in decades. "Been meaning to have that thing removed," he told me when I mentioned it, waving his hand dismissively. "But you know how it is with old properties, always something else that needs attention first." The smell got stronger as summer progressed, especially on hot afternoons. It reminded me of the time a raccoon had died under our old apartment building. Sweet and sickly, the kind of odor that seems to coat the inside of your nostrils. Emma started holding her breath when we walked past that area, making exaggerated gagging faces that would have been funny under different circumstances. By August, the stench was unbearable. I found myself taking longer routes around the property just to avoid that corner, but the smell seemed to follow me everywhere. It clung to my clothes and hair, and I started having nightmares about rotting things buried in dark places. When I brought it up to Benjamin again, his usual warm demeanor shifted slightly. His smile became tighter, more forced, and he avoided making eye contact. "Could be a septic issue," he suggested, but there was no septic system anywhere near that tank. Or maybe an animal crawled under there to die. These old farms, you know, nature has its way of taking care of things. But I had grown up in the country before moving to the city, and I knew what dead animals smelled like. This was different. This was worse. One evening while Emma was inside watching cartoons, I decided to investigate on my own. The setting sun cast long shadows across the property as I approached the water tank, breathing through my mouth to avoid the worst of the smell. The ground around the base of the tank was uneven, with patches of yellowed grass and areas where the soil looked darker, more compacted than the surrounding earth. I walked around the entire perimeter, noting how some sections seemed to have been disturbed more recently than others. There were tire tracks leading to and from the area, though Benjamin had told me he never drove back there anymore. As I knelt down to examine one particularly suspicious patch of ground, I noticed something that made my pulse quicken. A small piece of blue fabric poking up through the dirt, no bigger than a postage stamp. The fabric was definitely not natural. It looked like part of a synthetic material, maybe denim or canvas. I brushed away some of the loose soil around it and found more pieces, along with what appeared to be fragments of black plastic sheeting. My hands trembled as I dug a little deeper with a stick I found nearby, uncovering more plastic, and something that looked disturbingly like concrete chunks. The smell intensified as I worked, becoming so overwhelming that I had to step back and breathe deeply through my mouth. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. Benjamin was walking across the yard toward me, his expression unreadable in the fading light. "Find anything interesting?" he asked, his voice carrying a tone I had never heard before. Casual, but with an undercurrent of something that made every instinct in my body scream danger. "Just curious about the smell," I managed to say, standing up and brushing dirt off my knees. Benjamin nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the small hole I had started digging. "Curiosity killed the cat, as they say," he replied with that same strange smile. "But satisfaction brought it back, right?" He chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. "Why don't you head inside and get cleaned up? I'll take care of this area tomorrow. Been putting off dealing with it for too long anyway." That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the old cottage made me jump, and I found myself checking and rechecking the locks on our doors. Emma asked me why I looked so tired the next morning, and I told her I had been having bad dreams. It wasn't entirely a lie. The next few days, Benjamin was different. He still maintained his polite exterior, but I caught him watching me more closely when he thought I wasn't looking. He started asking questions about my daily routines, wanting to know exactly where I planned to be and when. "Just making sure you and Emma are safe out here," he'd say, but his eyes told a different story. I also noticed he had filled in the small hole I'd dug by the water tank, and the area had been covered with fresh gravel. When I asked about it, he simply said he'd had some landscaping work done, but I hadn't seen or heard any workers, and the gravel looked like it had been spread hastily, with uneven patches and gaps where the disturbed earth still showed through. I started making excuses to drive into town more often, taking Emma with me every time. During one of these trips, I stopped at the local diner and struck up a conversation with Janet, the waitress who had worked there for 30 years. She was a chatty woman with gray hair and knowing eyes, the type who seemed to know everyone's business. When I mentioned I was working at the Hayes farm, her expression changed immediately. "Oh, honey," she said, glancing around nervously before leaning closer. "You be careful out there. That place has a history." She told me about a girl named Sarah who had lived in the guest cottage about 20 years ago, helping Benjamin's wife Margaret with housework. Sweet little thing, couldn't have been more than 19. Then one day she just vanished, packed up and left without a word, according to Benjamin. But Janet's version was different from what she'd heard around town. "Some folks say she was pregnant," she whispered, refilling my coffee cup with shaking hands. "Others say she and Benjamin were, well, you know. Margaret was sick with cancer then, barely conscious most days. People talked, but nobody wanted to accuse a man of the cloth of anything improper." She paused, looking out the window toward the direction of the farm. "What's strange is that girl's car was found abandoned at the bus station 2 towns over, but nobody ever saw her get on any bus, and her belongings were left behind in the cottage. Clothes, photos, even her purse with all her money still in it. What kind of runaway leaves everything behind?" My coffee suddenly tasted bitter, and I could feel my appetite disappearing. "Did anyone ever investigate?" I asked. Janet shrugged. Sheriff back then was Benjamin's brother-in-law. Said there was no evidence of foul play, just a young girl who decided to start fresh somewhere else. That evening, I called my sister Lisa in Texas and told her everything. She didn't hesitate for a second. "Pack your stuff and get out of there tonight," she said firmly. "You can stay with us until you figure something else out." But leaving wasn't as simple as I wanted it to be. All our belongings were in the cottage. Emma was finally settled and happy, and I had nowhere near enough money saved for a security deposit on a new place. Plus, what if I was wrong? What if I was letting paranoia and small-town gossip drive me away from the best opportunity we'd had in years? I decided to give it one more day to see if I could find any concrete evidence that would either confirm my fears or put them to rest. I should have listened to Lisa. The next morning, Benjamin left early to visit his doctor in the next county over, a routine appointment he'd mentioned several times. Emma was at a neighbor's house for a play date. giving me the perfect opportunity to investigate properly. I went straight to the water tank with a real shovel this time, determined to dig deep enough to find out what was really buried there. The smell hit me like a physical wall as I got closer, stronger than ever in the morning heat. I started digging in the same spot where I'd found the fabric, and within minutes, I hit something solid. It was concrete, but it had been broken and hastily patched with what looked like quickset cement. As I cleared away more dirt, I could see the edges of black plastic sheeting underneath, and the smell became so intense I had to step back and vomit in the nearby grass. With trembling hands, I used the shovel to carefully pry up one corner of the plastic. What I saw underneath will haunt me for the rest of my life. Fresh, decomposing remains wrapped in garbage bags, and beneath that, older bones and clothing, including what was unmistakably a human skull, with long blonde hair still clinging to it. I ran back to the cottage, packed everything I could fit in my car in less than 20 minutes, and called Lisa while driving to pick up Emma. "Don't go back to that house," she kept saying. "Come straight here." But I couldn't leave without reporting what I'd found. I stopped at the police station in the nearest town and told them everything. The current sheriff, a younger man named Deputy Rodriguez, took my statement seriously and immediately organized a team to go to the farm. They arrested Benjamin that same afternoon as he returned from his doctor's appointment. When they fully excavated the area around the water tank, they found Sarah's remains from 20 years ago buried deeper, along with the fresh remains of another young woman who had been reported missing from a nearby town just 6 months earlier. Benjamin confessed to both murders, claiming Sarah's death had been an accident, but that he'd killed the second woman when she started asking too many questions about the missing girl after taking a job at a neighboring farm. He was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Emma and I are doing well now, living with Lisa's family in Texas while I finish nursing school. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't been curious about that smell, or if I hadn't been brave enough to dig. Both Sarah and the other victim finally got the justice they deserved, and that has to count for something. The first red flag should have been how eager everyone was to help us move in. Kevin and I had just gotten married in February 2022, and by June, we were completely burned out from city life in Chicago. We'd been talking about buying some land, maybe starting a small organic farm, living off the grid for a while. When we found this property outside Tulsa, 20 acres with a 2-story farmhouse that needed work but had character, we thought we'd hit the jackpot. The realtor, this middle-aged guy named Bob, was practically throwing the keys at us before we'd even finished the tour. Said the previous owners had been motivated sellers and left everything behind, even some of the furniture. What struck me as odd was how the neighbors kept showing up that first week with casseroles and welcome gifts. In Chicago, I barely knew the people in my apartment building, but here in rural Kansas, it seemed like half the county wanted to introduce themselves. There was Mrs. Henderson from down the road with her famous apple pie, the Johnson family from the next farm over with fresh eggs, and this older gentleman named Frank, who claimed he'd known the land since he was a boy. Everyone was friendly enough, but there was something in their eyes when they talked, like they were studying our reactions, waiting for us to ask the right questions. The house itself was beautiful in that weathered, authentic way that city folks like us romanticize. Original hardwood floors that creaked in specific spots, windows that stuck but let in the most gorgeous light, and a kitchen with an actual wood-burning stove that still worked. The previous owners had left behind some personal items, family photos on the mantle, clothes still hanging in the closets, even toiletries in the bathroom. Bob had explained that they'd moved suddenly for a job opportunity and couldn't take everything. At the time, it seemed like a blessing because we were starting from scratch and could use the extra household items. But after we'd been there about 2 weeks, I started noticing details that didn't add up. The family photos showed a couple around our age with 2 young kids, maybe 6 and 8 years old. There were school pictures, vacation shots, all the normal stuff you'd expect. But what got to me was how recent everything looked. The kids' clothes were current styles. The photos had that digital quality from the last few years. If they'd moved for a job, why leave behind their children's school pictures? Why abandon family memories that would be irreplaceable? Kevin thought I was overthinking it, said people leave stuff behind all the time when they're in a hurry. But something about it nagged at me. The breaking point came when I decided to ask Mrs. Henderson about the previous owners during one of her visits. I was being casual about it, just mentioned how nice it was that they'd left some things behind for us to use. The change in her demeanor was instant and unmistakable. Her whole face went pale and she started fidgeting with the dish towel in her hands like she was trying to strangle it. She mumbled something about how it was such a shame what happened to the Carlisle family, and then quickly changed the subject to asking if we needed help with the garden. When I pressed her about what she meant by what happened, she claimed she'd misspoken and hurried out of there like the house was on fire. That night, Kevin and I decided to do some digging. We found the previous owners' names on some mail that had been left behind, David and Jennifer Carlisle, with their kids Emma and Noah. A quick Facebook search turned up their profiles, but here's the thing that made my skin crawl. Their last posts were from exactly 1 year ago, and they weren't about moving or new job opportunities. Jennifer's final post was a photo of the kids playing in what I recognized as our backyard, with a caption about how much they loved their forever home. David's was even more unsettling. A status update about finally feeling like they belonged somewhere, posted just 3 days before their social media went completely silent. We tried calling the number on some of the mail, but it was disconnected. Kevin suggested we drive into town and see if anyone at the local businesses remembered them, maybe get some real answers about what had happened. The first stop was the hardware store, where the owner, a gruff man named Dale, got visibly uncomfortable when we mentioned the Carlisle name. He kept glancing around like he was worried someone might overhear us, and when I asked directly what had happened to them, he just shook his head and said we should let sleeping dogs lie. The same pattern repeated at the grocery store, the post office, and even the local diner. Everyone knew something, but nobody was talking. The first real warning came 3 days later, slipped under our front door while we were asleep. It was a piece of plain white paper with words cut out from magazines, like something from a bad horror movie. "Stop asking questions or you'll end up like them." Kevin wanted to take it to the police, but I convinced him to wait. We'd only been in town for a month, and making enemies of the locals wasn't going to help us build the life we wanted. Instead, we decided to be more subtle about our investigation, maybe check public records or old newspaper archives online. That's when we found the article that changed everything. It was buried in the archives of the local newspaper's website, dated exactly 13 months ago. Local family reported missing after failing to appear for scheduled appointments. The piece was frustratingly vague, mentioning that David Carlisle had missed an important business meeting and Jennifer had failed to pick up the kids from school. Their car was found in the driveway, keys still in the ignition, with no signs of struggle. The police had investigated but found no evidence of foul play. The family had simply vanished, leaving behind their entire lives as if they'd evaporated into thin air. But the really chilling part was what we discovered when we kept digging through the newspaper archives. This wasn't an isolated incident. Every few years, going back decades, there were similar stories. The Henderson family in 1987 disappeared from the same property, leaving behind a hot dinner on the table. The Morrison clan in 1994 vanished overnight, their livestock still in the barn, unfed for days before neighbors found them. The pattern was always the same. Families would buy our land, settle in, and then simply cease to exist. The local paper always reported them as missing, never found, never explained. And somehow the property always ended up back on the market within a year, usually sold well below market value to the next unsuspecting family. The second note appeared the morning after we printed out all those newspaper articles. This one was more direct. Leave now or join them. But what really terrified me was finding our dog, Buster, lying motionless by his food bowl that same afternoon. Kevin rushed him to the emergency vet in the next town over, but it was too late. The vet said it looked like poisoning, probably antifreeze based on the symptoms. Someone had deliberately killed our dog to send us a message. That night, neither of us slept. Every creak of the old house, every whistle of wind through the trees, had us both jumping out of our skin. Kevin wanted to pack up and leave immediately, but I was stubborn. We'd put everything we had into this place, and I wasn't about to let some small-town conspiracy run us off our own land. Instead, I decided to confront the one person who might actually tell us the truth. Frank, the old man who'd claimed to know the land since he was a boy. I found him at the local gas station the next morning and cornered him by his truck. When I mentioned the newspaper articles and the pattern of disappearances, his face went completely white. He kept looking around nervously, then finally grabbed my arm and whispered, "Meet me at the old cemetery on Mill Road tonight at midnight. Come alone and don't tell anyone." The cemetery was a small, overgrown plot behind an abandoned church about 5 miles from our house. Frank was already there when I arrived, smoking a cigarette with shaking fingers. He told me the whole truth in hushed, terrified whispers. The land our house sat on had been used for something terrible back in the 1800s, a mass grave for victims of a cholera outbreak that the town had covered up to avoid quarantine. But it wasn't just disease victims buried there. Local families who'd opposed the cover-up had been murdered and thrown into the same pit. According to Frank, the town had been keeping the secret for generations, and anyone who moved onto that cursed land and started asking too many questions ended up dead. The current residents weren't just neighbors. They were descendants of the original conspirators, bound by blood and guilt to protect the town's darkest secret. Frank himself was part of it, but he'd grown old and guilty and couldn't watch another family disappear. He begged me to take Kevin and run before it was too late. I raced home and found Kevin packing our essentials into garbage bags. He'd found a third note slipped under the door while I was gone, and this one included a photo, a picture of us sleeping in our bed, taken from inside our house. Someone had been in our home while we slept. We threw everything important into our car and drove straight to the nearest police station, which was in the next county over. The desk sergeant listened to our story with obvious skepticism until I showed him the newspaper articles and the threatening notes. He made some phone calls, and within an hour, state police were involved. Turns out, there had been a federal investigation into the area years ago, but it had been mysteriously shut down due to lack of evidence. The state police took our statement and arranged for us to stay in a hotel while they investigated. 3 days later, they called us with news that made my heart race. They'd excavated part of our property with ground-penetrating radar and found exactly what Frank had described: a mass grave containing dozens of bodies, some dating back over a century, others much more recent. DNA testing confirmed that some of the remains belonged to the missing families, including the Carlyles. The entire town leadership was arrested, along with several prominent families who'd been part of the conspiracy for generations. What we learned from the investigation was even more horrifying than we'd imagined. The town had been systematically murdering anyone who threatened to expose their secret, then disposing of the bodies in the same cursed ground where it all began. They'd perfected their system over the decades: lure in unsuspecting families with below-market real estate prices, monitor them for signs of curiosity, then eliminate them when they got too close to the truth. Frank had been telling the truth about everything, and his confession to the police helped uncover evidence that led to multiple life sentences for the conspirators. We never went back to that house. The state seized the property as a crime scene, and last I heard, it's been turned into a memorial for all the families who lost their lives there. Kevin and I moved to Oregon, started over completely, and we've never regretted running when we did. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Frank hadn't found the courage to warn us, but I try not to think about it too much. We were lucky to escape with our lives, unlike so many others who came before us. I had just finalized my divorce when the letter came. I hadn't spoken to Aunt Lillian since I was a teenager, and honestly, I barely remembered her voice. She wasn't the warm type. More like someone you tiptoed around at Thanksgiving. So when the lawyer told me I'd inherited her old farmhouse outside of Baraboo, Wisconsin, I didn't know how to feel. I was too emotionally drained to question it. My job was remote. I needed space, and the city was suffocating. A place with silence suddenly didn't sound so bad. The house was older than I expected, the kind of structure that creaks even when no one's moving. It sat at the end of a long gravel driveway flanked by dense trees and overgrowth. The paint had faded to a sickly pale yellow, and the porch sagged like it was holding its breath. Out back, just past a row of overgrown shrubs, stood a greenhouse, glass panels mostly intact but dulled by grime and time. From what I'd been told, that was where Aunt Lillian spent most of her time. She was known in local horticulture circles for her miracle soil blends, whatever that meant. The house itself was cluttered but not filthy. Lots of dried plants hanging upside down in bunches, jars of powders and crushed leaves labeled in tight cursive. There were framed awards on the wall: Soil Composition Excellence, 2008, Innovative Botanical Techniques, 2013. All stuff that would mean nothing to anyone outside that world. The greenhouse was locked with a rusted chain and a thick padlock. I let it be for a few days. I wasn't in the mood to poke around just yet. But that padlock started to gnaw at me. Why lock it up so tightly if you've got nothing to hide? I found the key in her bedroom inside a wooden jewelry box, tucked beneath velvet lining where a necklace might have once been. It was heavier than I expected. When I walked back to the greenhouse, I remember the air felt denser, like standing in a room just after someone's yelled, even if it was quiet. The padlock groaned open and the chain slithered to the ground. Inside, it smelled like earth and citrus rot, and the heat hit me immediately, thick, moist, and sharp like stepping into a lung. Rows of potted plants sat on benches, half of them dead, the others thriving in unnatural silence. One of the benches had a wide potting table built into it, and beneath that, a set of stacked wooden crates. Most were filled with tools: rusted shears, empty spray bottles, bags of labeled powders. But the one at the bottom was different. It wasn't dusty like the others. When I pulled it out, I noticed the floor beneath it was uneven. A knot in the wood, maybe. But when I pressed it, the panel beneath the table clicked and lifted slightly. I pried it up with a trowel. It opened into a shallow compartment barely a foot deep. What was inside made my chest tighten. There were dozens of folded pages wrapped in waxed cloth, all handwritten, some stained with what looked like dried mud or something darker. The first page started mid-thought. No greeting, no date, just, "The ratio must be exact. Too much bone meal slows the breakdown. Fresh tissue accelerates it." I thought it was part of a gardening journal, until I saw a name. I read it again. Nicole Fenwick. I knew that name. She went missing 4 years ago. I remember her photo plastered on gas pumps and telephone poles. I flipped to the next page. Nicole wasn't hydrated enough. Skin resisted absorption. Must try again with higher saline balance. I sat back so fast I nearly knocked over a tray of seedlings. I wish I could say I stopped reading, but I didn't. The pages weren't ordered, just entries stuffed together like she'd written them in a rush. Each one focused on someone different, some only by first name, others full names I'd later Google. Every single one had been reported missing in Wisconsin over the past decade. The way she wrote wasn't emotional, just clinical. Eli bled too fast, less viable. Jocelyn's hair clogged the drainage mesh. There were diagrams too, sketches of root systems and human limbs next to each other, as if comparing the stages of decay. I couldn't stop shaking. It wasn't metaphorical. She wasn't writing poetry. She was documenting something real. I took the pages inside, spread them out on the dining table under a lamp. Some were written on the backs of seed catalogs, others on torn notebook paper. There were photos too, blurry Polaroids of soil trays and plant beds. One showed a boot sticking out from under a layer of mulch, Another had a timestamp and what looked like a forearm, covered in dirt and partially decomposed, laid beside a measuring tape. My mouth went dry. In one image, barely visible in the background, was that same greenhouse table, same chipped edge, same cracked tile corner. The more I looked, the more it felt like the whole greenhouse was one massive experiment. I barely slept that night. Every sound the house made felt amplified. The groan of the floorboards, the tapping of branches against the windows, the low hum of the old fridge. At around 3 a.m., I heard something from the backyard. Not loud. Just a subtle dragging sound like something being pulled slowly across the greenhouse floor. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. I wanted to believe it was the wind or an animal. But the sound had rhythm. It wasn't random. I waited until the sun came up to check, and when I got to the greenhouse, I noticed 2 pots had been moved from the bench. Slightly, maybe an inch. But I hadn't touched them. I called the police. I didn't tell them everything, just said I found something disturbing among my aunt's things, and I thought it might be connected to missing persons. They sent a young deputy and an older detective. I watched them as they sifted through the documents, their expressions tightening with every page. They asked if I had tampered with anything else. I told them no. They said they'd need to take everything for analysis and might need to search the property more thoroughly. I asked if I should stay somewhere else. They said that was up to me, but the tone made it clear. Yes, I should. They found 3 shallow burial sites behind the greenhouse, just past the tree line. One had bone fragments, another had decayed clothing with trace DNA. The third had nothing, just unusually rich soil with high nitrogen levels. I didn't want to know more. I left that same night, drove back to my sister's place 3 hours away, and haven't returned since. The county later declared the land a restricted site pending investigation. I signed over the rights to it and told them I wanted nothing to do with it. I never even went back to pack my things. I just left. Sometimes I wonder if she ever meant for me to find it. Maybe it was some twisted way of passing the torch, or maybe just a final confession she couldn't say out loud. I don't know. What I do know is that greenhouse wasn't for growing plants. It was for breaking people down. And every time I see a pot of soil now, especially the dark, moist kind that looks too healthy to be natural, I wonder where it really came from, and what was left behind to make it grow so well. Back then, life was quiet, maybe even too quiet. I'd moved with my kids, Logan and May, to a small farm in rural Alabama after the divorce, looking for something slower, something steadier. I worked part-time fixing tractors and did odd repairs for neighbors, but most days were spent tending to the animals and keeping the kids fed and focused on school. The house was old, creaked in the wind, but it had a good roof and a wide stretch of land. It wasn't much, but it was ours, and for a while things felt calm in a way I hadn't felt in years. That changed in late October. It started with the goats. 3 of them, gone overnight. No signs of a struggle. No blood, no broken fencing. I figured coyotes, maybe even a bobcat. I reinforced the gate, added solar lights along the edge of the fence line, and started keeping my shotgun closer to the door. But the next week I found a young steer dead, its eyes missing and stomach oddly deflated, like something had drained it without a single tear in the hide. It didn't sit right. No scavenger does that. I borrowed 2 trail cameras from my cousin and strapped them to the fence posts overlooking the north pasture, the spot with the worst visibility. There's a slight slope in the field there, and the grass grows just tall enough to hide something lying low. I didn't expect much, honestly. Just needed proof for animal control or something to show a neighbor if we had trespassers. The cameras were motion-triggered, and I checked them every morning at dawn. The first 2 nights, nothing. Just grainy images of wind-blown grass and the occasional possum or barn owl flying through frame. But on the 3rd night, 3:12 a.m. exactly, I saw it. At first, I couldn't tell what I was looking at. It wasn't standing. It wasn't walking. It was crawling, low and slow, across the edge of the pasture, just within the infrared range. A man, naked, or close to it. Pale, thin, like he hadn't eaten in weeks. His elbows jutted out wide as he dragged himself forward in this unnatural, almost mechanical rhythm. No other animals around. No glowing eyes in the dark, just him. He never looked at the camera, but he moved with purpose, toward the barn. I didn't tell the kids. Logan had already been nervous at night since the goat incident, and May was only 6, too young to make sense of anything like this. I spent the day checking the fence line, finding no breaks, no drag marks, nothing. That night I stayed up, sat in the old rocking chair by the front window with the lights off and a thermos of black coffee in hand. I watched the tree line and waited. Nothing moved, just the usual sounds, crickets, the wind against the shutters, the rustle of leaves. I thought maybe I imagined it. Maybe the camera glitched, caught something mid-motion that looked human but wasn't. I told myself that, until the next morning. There were footprints in the garden, bare feet, adult-sized, deep enough to tell he was pressing low to the ground. They led from the fence to the back of the barn, where the lock had been snapped clean in half. Inside, one of the hens was gone. Not killed, just gone. The others were quiet, not frantic, not a single feather disturbed. That's what unsettled me the most. Whatever came through didn't scare them. I replayed the footage again and again. Each time I watched him crawl, I noticed something new. The way his limbs didn't quite bend the right way. The way his neck seemed to twist too far when he shifted directions. This wasn't just some strung-out drifter. Something was wrong with this man, if he even was a man. I set up more cameras, 6 this time, and repositioned the floodlights. Put a heavy chain on the barn door. Kept the kids sleeping in my room just in case. Around midnight, I took the shotgun and stepped out onto the porch. The night was still. Too still. No wind, no insects. Just this dense silence, like everything was holding its breath. I walked the perimeter twice. On the third pass, I heard it, just past the corn rows, maybe 50 yards out. A soft, rhythmic thud, not footsteps, elbows against soil. I raised the light but saw nothing. Just the rows of corn gently swaying like someone had passed through seconds before. I didn't sleep, not even with the kids curled up in blankets on the floor beside me. I kept thinking about the way he moved, like he'd spent his whole life crawling, like standing up wasn't even an option. When the sun finally came up, I rushed out to check the cameras. 4 of them had gone dark, batteries drained. Only 2 still had footage. The clearest clip showed him again, this time closer. Still crawling, still silent. But at one point he paused, lifted his head toward the camera, not directly at it, but almost through it. His face was hollow, cheekbones sharp like broken glass. Eyes wide open, too wide, like they didn't blink. Mouth half open like he was mid-breath. I didn't watch the clip again. That same afternoon, I drove into town and bought floodlights strong enough to light a baseball field. I wired them to motion sensors and placed them all around the property, barn, porch, even the tree line. I also picked up a set of industrial locks and switched every single latch on the barn, the chicken coop, the sheds. I didn't want to explain too much to the kids, but Logan noticed the tension. He kept asking why I was locking the coop during the day, why I carried the shotgun into the house instead of keeping it in the truck. I told him we might have a trespasser, that's all. He didn't believe me, but he stopped asking. The next few nights were quiet. I started thinking maybe I'd scared it off, whatever it was. The cameras didn't pick up anything, no new footprints, no sounds. The animals stayed put. The air felt lighter. I even let the kids go back to their own beds. But on the 5th night, just as I was starting to drift off, every light on the property triggered at once. The house lit up like daylight. I jumped out of bed and grabbed the gun, ran out onto the porch barefoot. The fields were glowing under all that artificial light. And in the far corner, just where the pasture dips down near the ditch, I saw him. Crawling, not toward the barn this time, toward the house. He was faster now, jerky like a puppet yanked on strings. His elbows and knees dug into the earth as he shot forward in quick bursts. I fired a warning shot in the air. He didn't stop. I aimed lower and fired again, closer this time. Dirt exploded near his side and he stopped cold. Didn't move. Just lay there, half in shadow, head tilted at a sharp angle, watching me. I couldn't see his eyes from that far, but I felt them. Then, just as suddenly, he reversed. Not turned around, reversed. Same position, same crawl, only backward. Still looking straight at me the whole time, until he vanished behind the slope. I stood there, gun in hand, until the lights slowly clicked off one by one. I called the sheriff the next morning. He came out, looked around, took a report, found no prints, no sign of a break-in. He asked if maybe it was a prank, someone messing with me. I didn't argue, just showed him the footage. He watched silently, then closed the laptop and told me to keep the kids inside at night. That was it. Since then, it's been quiet again. No more lights, no more footage. I still check the cameras every morning, even swapped out the batteries religiously. But I haven't seen him again. I don't know what it was or what it wanted, but I don't walk into the fields after dark anymore. Not even with a flashlight. Not even with a gun.